Internet connection types. There's more than you think. Find out what they are next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
You may be like a lot of people out there that just think that all they have to do, of course, is get a cell phone and that they're connected to the internet. There's actually more connection types, especially if you're an IT professional, and here to tell us more about it, Mr. Wes Brand. All right, Wes, what are we going to dive into when we start talking about the idea of connection types here?
You know, try to demystify that because like you said, Ronnie, maybe we have some home users out there that are only familiar with, one connection type, maybe that little modem they have in their house. Well, when you are in the industry, there are a variety of types that you can actually use in order to connect, and they have some pros and cons, and that's what we're going to do in this episode. First, to identify what they are, talk about them, and then do a little bit of compare and contrast.
Well, it sounds like it's time for us to get started. Head on over to the bench.
All right, everyone, come on over here. And don't worry, we didn't steal Ronnie's credit card or anything before the show. We are going to go ahead, though, and we're going to look at a few providers, because when it comes to internet connection types, you're typically going to go through an internet service provider. And in no particular order, we're just going to go ahead and we'll talk about some of the options. One of the very first ones that's actually been around for a bit and is now becoming a little bit more available in the residential markets is what is known as fiber optic internet connections, right? Fiber optic, you can see that there are a variety of technologies. Maybe you've heard of Verizon's Fios, right? That's the fiber optic internet service, if you will. For instance, AT&T has business class fiber optics here. So to kind of show you this, you can see that you're going to pay a penny, but notice some of the speeds that you can get. And that's one of the things that I really want you all to pay attention to. Fiber optic internet connections have about one of the longest transmission distances of all of our bounded cable type media. They provide very high speed internet connections, but as you can see, they do come with a price, and you can see that you can get things like gigabit internet speed. So fiber optic communications, keep in mind, it's one of the more expensive type internet connections, but it is one that provides you with a great amount of bandwidth. And well, the more money you throw at the internet service provider, you can get all the way up to a gigabit and sometimes even beyond, depending on the area. And that is one thing that I want you to keep in mind. We're going to mention some of these, but some of these are available in certain areas and some of them are not available in certain areas. And that's one of the things about fiber. Fiber, we're relying upon those providers who have they've laid the fiber, right? So pay attention to the availability in your local area. That's going to be important.
That's probably one of the most important aspects, especially if you're going to be a support technician for somebody looking to actually get into fiber. You may have to actually investigate which one is actually going to be available for you. You may find out one type is available, but the other one isn't. So make sure you do a little bit more investigative research as you go on there. Now, because of that availability, right, because people are actually now planting or installing more and more fiber optic lines, it's going to become more readily available. But right now, it still isn't the most readily available. What we tend to see out there, though, is something like cable, right?
Absolutely, Ronnie. Cable internet. Let's just talk about the cable technologies in general. When we talk about cable, we're talking about the coaxial cable type implementations when it comes to network communications. Coaxial cables are probably one of the oldest network technologies we have in the industry today. And if it wasn't for certain technologies, it might have fell by the wayside with for instance, things like fiber optic communications coming online. But cable uses a coaxial cabling, and it typically is an RJ6 cable. And if you have, any of you have seen, maybe have a cable modem, you'll see that you have a coaxial cable coming out of the wall going into the back of that modem. Now, the cable modems, if you will, I also want to just mention briefly a standard that I want you to associate with cable modems, because cable modems allow you to not only send things like internet, but TV and phone across a single cable. And they use a technology called DOCSIS. That's the Data Over Cable Service Interface Specification. The thing that I want you to know about DOCSIS, very generically, it's the specification that allowed us to adapt to new types of communication and allow that data to flow over those cable lines, if you will. Again, one of the things I want to keep you in mind of is the fact that the cable internet is a shared bandwidth. which is one of the reasons you might see speeds fluctuate. You might see that, hey, right there at 8 a.m. when everybody gets to work, we start to see performance kind of wane a little bit, or maybe you get home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, whichever time zone you might be in, and you start to notice that speeds drop. Well, with a cable communication, a cable internet type, you have, let's say, your piece of the pie. You have a shared connection with other people that are within your areas. So we can kind of look at, just some of the plans out there so you can get an idea of some of the speeds. Believe it or not, we can get, if it wasn't for that DOCSIS specification, we wouldn't be getting some of the speeds that we see comparable to other internet technologies today. Notice that we can get internet anywhere from 50 megs all the way up to 1 gigabit. All right, and we can also get TV if we want to. Not included in the package, but here to see that it's a convergence technology where you have multiple communication types going over a single internet connection. You can also potentially do things like phone over those communication types as well. Keep in mind that these are one of the most prevalent, if you will, internet connection types that you see today, and especially in residential areas, it certainly is one of the more common types that you might have to support. So in a certification exam, I would know some of the specifications. When it comes to if you're in a support role, you should be aware of this one because it's one of the potential internet connections that you'll see the most.
Yeah, there's no doubt that probably one of the biggest complaints that you do hear from people getting cable internet for the first time is that sometimes it actually seems like the fastest thing that they've ever been on for their connections, and then other times it's actually slower, and that's because what Wes had mentioned here, which is the shared access that we tend to have. So when everybody's at home and everybody's streaming Netflix and doing whatever else, you're going to see, of course, speeds get slower. But you might find out like during the middle of the night or a little, when people are actually asleep or they're not home, you get really good speeds that actually kind of go up to what they actually say that it's going to go up to. There is a way that we can prevent this, which is by actually trying to get what we call some type of service level agreement to do so, but that's going to be much more expensive. But it is more widely distributed at this point in time than what we see in terms of fiber. But Wes, even more widely distributed than that is what we call the idea of dial-up here. So Wes, this is pretty legacy at this point. What do we need to know about dial-up?
It sure is. Some people might say, well, we're recording this in 2022. Some people might say, man, you're talking about dial-up. What a legacy or antiquated technology that is. Yes, but it's still heavily used. And why is that? And that's because telephone lines have been around since the 1800s. So it is one of the widest deployed communication technologies out there. And these lines that I'm talking about, these telephone lines, are what is known as a public switched telephone network, all right, PSTN. Dial-up, if you will, I'll show you that yes, it is still available, and yes, you still can buy it. It is a low-cost, low-speed communication technology, and I want you to get over the high-speed accelerated dial-up. That's not what I want you to focus on because that's kind of a niche market, right? This free dial-up that you see, 10 hours a month, this is the one that was probably more common, and that's one that gives you the 56 kilobytes per second speeds. Dial-up is still in use in areas where there aren't cables that can be run, where there isn't maybe the ability to, for whatever reason or another, have satellite. I will tell you, you also will see things like dial-up used in disaster recovery when your other network connections get hit with natural disasters. Because of so many phone lines being available, it can still be used in disaster recovery. So yes, everyone, I know it's a legacy technology. We put it in here because if you're in a certification endeavor, you might see it on an exam. And if you happen to work in an industry where maybe you're doing some kind of disaster recovery, you might see them bring in these devices called modems that modulate and demodulate those analog signals from your computer, or the digital signals, excuse me, from your computer, modulate them, and then send them over an analog telephone line to its source, or its destination, I should say. So that's your dial-up. Keep in mind, low cost, low speed alternative when it comes to an internet connection type.
Yeah, with that, along with that, natural disasters and different things, one of the things you can count on, especially with the idea of dial-up here, is that it will pretty much be one of the first systems that's actually going to be up if it goes down. most of the telephone lines that we tend to actually hear about today, they're already buried cable and not really susceptible to a lot. Now, I can't say it's actually like, it won't be taken down at all, but usually if it is, it's actually going to be one of the systems that is going to be brought up first. So this is why it is important for things like what Wes was talking about in terms of disaster recovery. You need to ensure that you actually get up, your connection back up and first going. Well, dial-up may be an alternative plan for you. Now, along with that, and something that piggybacks off of the idea of dial-up a little bit here, is DSL. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So that's digital subscriber line. And digital subscriber line, if you will, is digital signals, just like Ronnie was kind of alluding to, that are basically modulated and sent over PSTN lines as well, those telephone lines. One of the benefits about this is the fact that you can actually separate the telephone signal and the data signal, so you can use your telephone and you can use the internet at the same time. With that legacy technology of dial-up, if you are dialing up on the modem, you cannot use your home landline. So DSL gives you this ability that you can use existing telephone lines and send digital signals. You can also use the telephone and the internet at the same time. But here's another thing too. It also allows for a lot greater speeds than the dial-up days did. Now, I do want you to understand that the speeds that DSL gets is directly related to the distance from the telecommunication provider switch. So there's all kinds of different speeds. There's speeds that I've seen that are up to around about 200 megabits. But you had to be very, very close to the telecommunication switch. And that's one of the limitations to DSL, is that DSL has a maximum distance of around 18,000 feet that it can operate away from your telecommunication provider. So there's a limitation on that. DSL can be deployed as long as you're close to that provider. It does use a modem, and let me show you, because there are some DSL providers out there. I just happen to have AT&T's pack it up, and one of the things I want to show you is that this isn't uncommon for DSL. Notice that we have a download speed of around 100 megabytes, but we have an upload speed of around 20 megabytes. So why are those different? Well, there's only really one specific DSL technology that I really want you to pay attention to. It's one of the most common, and that's called asynchronous, ADSL. And the asynchronous just means that the upload speeds and the download speeds do not match. So big takeaways from DSL is the fact that you can use those existing telephone lines as well as use your telephone and internet at the same time. Speeds and availability are directly related to the proximity of the telecommunication provider.
Yeah, that actually kind of makes sense. Again, one of the things that you will also hear, especially with DSL, the further away you are with the switch, more likely the slower your connection is going to be. So even if they offer you whatever that DSL connection is and it says 20 megabits, right? Well, that's probably pretty close to that switch that Wes was mentioning. But as you head towards that 1 mile, or half a mile mark, whatever it is, 18,000 feet of I can't remember, 5,200. So about 2.5, 3 miles or so. Yeah. Once you get closer to that 3 mile limit, you're going to start finding out something, that your speeds are going to drop dramatically, even though you have that same DSL connection, because it is further away.
Absolutely. It could drop as low as like 1 meg.
Oh, yeah.
So again, as you get farther. Ronnie, there's another technology that, we've talked a lot of technologies that kind of bind us to a certain location, right? We've talked about fiber, we've talked about cable, we've talked about dial-up and DSL, but these are very limiting in the fact that they require a physical bounded connection. Well, there are times when you live in areas where companies just don't lay cabling. Companies, you're too far away from a telecommunication provider to even consider DSL, if you will. There may not be any telephone lines in the area that you're in. So we have a couple of technologies that allow us to get over the physical limitations of cabling when it's just not feasible, and especially in rural areas. And one of those is going to be known as cellular communications. Now, cellular communications, ladies and gentlemen, these are exactly what you are using on your cell phone. But the good thing is anymore, it's not just restrictive to just, I have to have a cell phone to have a cellular communication. Let me show you what I mean here. So for instance, we have T-Mobile, and again, we're not endorsing any one of these products, but you can utilize it as a training, resource, if you will. So What are we doing here? What is this? Well, this is a cellular access point, and it allows you to set up a 5G gateway. Fifth generation, right? We're using technologies like LTE. We're using technologies potentially like CDMA, UTMS-based networks, and it allows us to jump on cellular networks to obtain our connections. One of the things that is great about this, that it's going to differ from the next one that we're going to talk about, is that this allows you mobile wireless internet access, and that's one of the key points to remember for this internet connection type.
Yeah, this particular technology does rely on those different towers, and they're spaced apart. So hopefully what happens is you can actually continue to drive and not drop that connection that actually seems like a big drop at all. Now, with that though, that is not the farthest, in other words, that's not the longest distance type of connection that we have. With the idea of wireless here, essentially, Wes, we have to talk about satellite, which is actually completely unbounded even to the Earth.
That is true. They're very true. So satellite is probably one of the farthest reaching wireless transmission mediums, mechanisms, methods, if you will, that we have. So satellites, it uses a satellite in orbit, and it transmits to a base station that turns around and transmits potentially to your satellite dish. So for instance, give you an example here, I just happen to have Starlink up, and they kind of show you their satellite dish here, and they tell you that it's low latency broadband internet, here's the kicker, across the globe, like Ronnie said. So what's the difference between cellular? Basically what this is more for is this is for fixed wireless communication, right? There is the ability to have mobile satellite communications if you ever see like a weather truck past you, but they're very expensive, right? I want you to think of things like Dish TV, Dish Network, right? These are examples of satellite communications. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind about this one, and really cellular communications in general, is that they're affected by the weather. So while they do allow us the flexibility of not having to lay physical cabling, they also come with some things that can affect them. Atmospheric conditions, if you will, signal propagation. It's all something to take in mind or keep in mind when you are going to either recommend or be using these technologies.
Yeah, no, it's not only weather. If a bird decides to land on your dish, you're kind of out. I mean, you really are. So anything that blocks that signal is pretty much the key, right? So this we tend to see, like we said, in those areas where they're not going to run any type of upgrade to the existing telephone lines, or actually the cable company's never going to come out. So this is probably more rural America, and even around the globe here is where we'll see this connection. And with Starlink coming on board with their own set of constellation of satellites, it's going to become more and more popular in that sense. Now, Wes, this last one, I actually think you're joking about this, but I did actually see it. WISP. What in the world is WISP?
WISP. I don't. Man, it sounds like a new sports drink or something. No, that is actually another acronym. That's Wireless Internet Service Provider, and this is more of a generic term because technically, if you think about it, a satellite communication is a wireless provision, right? But what this is this is like cellular, if you will. This is like your 5G cellular technologies, if you will, your satellite communications. It's used for the same purposes. In rural areas where we're not close enough to the telco to provide DSL, we don't have cabling, those networks aren't even present, maybe they're limited, we can have wireless communications and gain access to the internet. These use a variety of technologies, not something I think beyond the scope of an exam certification or even a support role, but I want you to know they use a variety of technologies. Some use things like our 802.11 wireless Wi-Fi mesh networks. Some of them use the 2.4 gigahertz industrial, scientific, and medical band, the 5 gigahertz network, 60 gigahertz as well. It's all different types of technologies that are used in a variety of frequencies. But like all wireless communications, kind of like Ronnie and I have mentioned, there are two things that are challenging to wireless internet service providers, and one is the line of sight that we've talked about. Satellite too, it's a line of sight communication, and if you don't have that line of sight, you start to run the risk of having performance degrading on you. The other thing is non-line of sight signal propagation. There are technologies that say, hey, I don't have to have a direct line of sight, but if you talk about deploying this in a metropolitan area type network, well, here's the issue. You might have reflections, you might have signal degradation over that. So there are some challenges, but one of the key takeaways is where we cannot provide things like bounded media, DSL and cable connections, we can potentially go to a wireless internet service provider and gain internet connectivity.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.